The Capuchin catacombs of Palermo were silent, as they had been for centuries. The air was thick with the weight of history, and the walls seemed to whisper secrets of the dead. Among the thousands of mummified bodies lining the corridors, one stood out. A young girl named Rosemary. She lay in a glass coffin, her hands folded neatly over her chest, her face so perfectly preserved, it seemed as though she were only sleeping. But Rosemary had been dead for over 100 years. Visitors came from all over the world to see her. Some were drawn by the scientific marvel of her preservation, while others were lured by the chilling legends that surrounded her. It was said that every night, long after the catacombs closed to the public, Rosemary's eyes would open. No one could explain how or why, but the stories persisted, passed down through generations like a dark fairy tale. One evening, as the last of the tourists filed out of the catacombs, a young historian named David lingered behind. He had spent years studying Rosemary's case, fascinated by the mystery of her preservation. The caretakers, used to his presence, allowed him to stay a little longer. David approached the glass coffin, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. He stared at Rosemary's face, searching for any sign of the phenomenon he had heard so much about. "It's impossible," he muttered to himself. "Eyes don't just open on their own after death." But as the words left his mouth, a cold draft swept through the corridor, extinguishing his flashlight. For a moment, there was complete darkness. Then a faint glow emanated from the coffin. David's breath caught in his throat as he watched Rosemary's eyelids flutter and then slowly open. Her eyes were a deep, haunting blue, and they seemed to stare directly into his soul. David stumbled back, his heart pounding. This wasn't supposed to happen. It couldn't be real. But there she was, looking at him as if she had been waiting for him all along. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, snapping David out of his trance. He turned toward the noise, but the corridor was empty. When he looked back at the coffin, Rosemary's eyes were closed again, her face as peaceful as ever. Had he imagined it, or had something truly supernatural just occurred? And David didn't have time to think. The caretakers were coming to lock up for the night, and he knew he had to leave. But as he hurried out of the catacombs, one thought consumed him. He had to uncover the truth about Rosemary. What was she trying to tell him? And why had she chosen him to witness her secret? That night, David couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rosemary's piercing blue stare. It wasn't just the shock of seeing her eyes open. It was the way she had looked at him. As if she knew him. As if she had been waiting for him to come. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with questions. Was it a trick of the light, a hallucination, or something far more unsettling? By dawn, David was back at the catacombs, determined to find answers. The caretakers, accustomed to his frequent visits, let him in without question. He made his way to Rosemary's coffin, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living things. David knelt beside the glass coffin and studied Rosemary's face. She looked exactly as she had the night before, peaceful, serene, and utterly lifeless. But something felt different. The air around her coffin was colder, and the shadows seemed to gather closer, as if they were watching him. He pulled out his notebook, flipping through pages of research he had compiled over the years. Rosemary had died in 1910, just 2 years old, from an unknown illness. Her father, a wealthy merchant, had paid a fortune to have her body preserved using a secret embalming technique. The process had been so effective that her skin remained soft, her features untouched by decay, but no one had ever been able to explain how or why her eyes were said to open at night. As David scribbled down his observations, he noticed something strange. The shadows around the coffin seemed to shift, forming shapes that almost looked like words. He leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. The shadows twisted again, and for a brief moment he thought he saw the letters HELP etched into the darkness. He jerked back, his heart racing. "This is insane," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Shadows don't spell words. I'm losing it." But the shadows didn't stop. They continued to move, swirling around the coffin like a living mist. David's instincts screamed at him to leave, but his curiosity held him in place. He reached out his hand, trembling, and touched the glass of the coffin. The moment his fingers made contact, a sharp, icy pain shot through his arm. He yanked his hand back, gasping. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him in darkness. For a moment he couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the darkness receded, leaving him standing alone in the corridor. But he wasn't alone. Rosemary's eyes were open again, and this time her lips were moving. No sound came out, but David could read the words on her lips. David's legs gave out and he collapsed to the floor. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? A trick of his exhausted mind? Or was Rosemary truly trying to communicate with him from beyond the grave? Before he could gather his thoughts, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. David scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. The caretakers were coming, and he knew he couldn't let them see him like this. He glanced back at the coffin one last time. Rosemary's eyes were closed again, her face as still as death. But the shadows around her coffin continued to twist and writhe, as if they were alive. And waiting, David's heart pounded as he prepared to recite the incantation. The words were ancient, their meaning lost to time, but their power was undeniable. As he began to speak, the shadows around him surged forward, twisting and writhing like living things. The air grew colder, and the candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing in the darkness. His voice trembled as he continued the incantation, each word feeling heavier than the last. Suddenly the ground beneath him began to shake and the walls of the catacomb seemed to close in. The shadows within the circle began to swirl, forming a vortex of darkness. David's heart raced as he realized something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The incantation wasn't just reversing the binding spell, it was awakening something far more powerful. The shadows surged forward, engulfing the circle and pulling him into their depths. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around him dissolved into darkness, and he felt himself falling into an endless void. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the catacombs. He stood in a vast, shadowy landscape. The ground beneath him cracked and barren. The sky above was a swirling mass of black clouds, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. In the distance, he saw a figure, a young girl with long dark hair and piercing blue eyes. Rosemary. She stood there, her expression filled with sorrow and longing. David tried to call out to her, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. She reached out to him, her hand trembling, and whispered a single word. "Help." David's heart ached as he realized the truth. The ritual had pulled him into the shadow realm, a place between life and death, where Rosemary's soul was trapped. But he wasn't alone. The shadows around him began to take shape, forming grotesque, twisted figures that reached for him with clawed hands. He had to find a way to free Rosemary and escape this place before the shadows consumed them both. But how? The incantation had failed, and he was trapped in a realm where the rules of the living no longer applied. The ground beneath David's feet was cracked and dry, and the air was thick with suffocating darkness. The twisted figures around him hissed and snarled, their glowing eyes fixed on him as they closed in. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to think. He had to find a way out. Rosemary stood a few feet away, her small figure trembling as she reached out to him. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the chaos like a knife. "Help me." David took a step toward her, but the shadowy figures moved faster, blocking his path. They were formless yet menacing, their shapes shifting and writhing like smoke. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had no weapons, no tools, just his wits and his determination. "Rosemary," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast empty landscape. "I'm here to help you, but you have to trust me." The girl's eyes widened and she nodded slowly. She pointed to the ground beneath her feet, where a faint glowing symbol was etched into the cracked earth. David recognized it immediately. It was the same symbol from the book, the one that represented the binding spell. The shadows surged forward, their clawed hands reaching for him. David ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding their grasp. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted toward Rosemary, the shadowy figures hot on his heels. As he reached her, he noticed something strange. The symbol on the ground was glowing brighter, and the air around it seemed to hum with energy. "What do I do?" David asked, his voice desperate. Rosemary pointed to the locket he still clutched in his hand. "Break it," she whispered, "break the chain." David didn't hesitate. He snapped the delicate chain of the locket, and the moment it broke, the symbol on the ground flared with blinding light. The shadowy figures shrieked and recoiled, their forms dissolving into smoke. The ground beneath his feet began to shake, and the air around him grew colder. Rosemary's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to him. "Thank you," she whispered, "but you have to go, now." David shook his head. "I'm not leaving without you." But Rosemary's form was already fading, her body dissolving into light. The symbol on the ground began to crack, and the shadow realm started to collapse around them. David felt a powerful force pulling him backward, dragging him away from Rosemary and back toward the world of the living. "No," he shouted, reaching out to her, "I can't leave you here." But it was too late. The light engulfed him, and the shadow realm dissolved into nothingness. When David opened his eyes, he was back in the catacombs, lying on the cold stone floor. The candles had burned out, and the sacred circle was gone. The lock of hair, the vial of blood, and the broken locket lay scattered around him, their power spent. David sat up, his head spinning. The air around him was still and silent, and the shadows no longer twisted or writhed. He looked toward Rosemary's coffin, his heart pounding. The glass lid was open, and the coffin was empty. David's breath caught in his throat. He scrambled to his feet and approached the coffin, his hands trembling. Where was she? Had the ritual worked, or had he made things worse? As he stared into the empty coffin, he felt a cold draft sweep through the corridor. The shadows around him shifted, and for a moment, he thought he saw a faint glowing figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was Rosemary. Her form was translucent and ethereal, her eyes filled with gratitude. She smiled at him, and then she faded into the darkness. David's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know if he had truly set her free or if he had only made things worse. But one thing was certain: the mystery of Rosemary's preserved body would haunt him for the rest of his life. Days turned into weeks, and David couldn't shake the memory of what had happened in the catacombs, the empty coffin, the glowing figure of Rosemary, the shadow realm. It all played on a loop in his mind. He spent hours poring over the diary and the book of ancient rituals, searching for answers. But the more he read, the more he realized how little he truly understood. The catacombs had changed since that night. The air felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive. Visitors still came to see the mummified bodies, but Rosemary's coffin remained empty, a silent reminder of the mystery that had captivated so many. The caretakers avoided the subject, and Jeppy refused to speak of it at all. David tried to move on, to focus on his work, but he couldn't. He felt a lingering connection to Rosemary, as if her presence still lingered in the corners of his mind. He often found himself wandering the catacombs late at night, drawn to the spot where he had performed the ritual. The shadows no longer twisted or writhed, but he could still feel their presence, watching him. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, he noticed something strange. The broken locket he had taken from Rosemary's coffin was glowing faintly, its delicate rose engraving shimmering in the dim light. David picked it up, his heart racing. The metal was warm to the touch, and as he held it, he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. He didn't know how or why, but he knew Rosemary was finally free. The ritual had worked, and her soul had moved on. The locket was a reminder of her gratitude, a symbol of the bond they had shared in those fleeting moments in the shadow realm. As he sat there, staring at the locket, he felt a cold draft sweep through the room. The shadows shifted, and for a moment, he thought he saw a faint glowing figure standing in the corner. It was Rosemary. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, and then she faded into the darkness. David smiled back, a sense of closure washing over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Rosemary's story would stay with him forever, a haunting reminder of the thin line between life and death, and the mysteries that lie beyond.